Joining me first on the show is Syed Akbaruddin, who served as India's permanent representative to the UN from January 2016 to April 2020. He's joining me from New Delhi. Ambassador Akbaruddin has been also very vocal about the slow pace of reforms in the UN, and particularly that he spoke in the context of Security Council. So thank you so much for speaking to NDTV. You had likened the reform process to a Greek tragedy, where despite years of discussions, little progress has been made. We are living at a time when there are multiple live conflicts. Is UN inconsequential, irrelevant, and why is it really irrelevant?
So Mariam, first of all, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to engage with you and through you to your large audience. Having said that, I acknowledge the fact that the peace and security architecture of the United Nations is not fit for purpose in the 21st century because it represents an archaic architecture of the past, the challenges that we face now, and the countries that can bring solutions to these are different. So I accept that peace and security, there are challenges, but let's not forget that these challenges are not limited to peace and security. There are multiple other challenges in the world relating to climate change, humanitarian affairs, outer space, etc., the health, and we are moving into securitization of many other arenas. Now, if you take it in the whole, the UN has a role to play in those. It doesn't have in conventional warfare like we are seeing right now in West Asia, but then West Asia is being a challenge for everybody. It was there in 1947 when the first time the UN dealt with West Asia. 70 years plus since then, there's been no solution, but nobody else has provided a solution. So it's not fair to say the UN alone is to blame. There are some knotty problems which nobody is able to resolve for reasons whether one side or the other doesn't want to follow it. So I wouldn't put all the blame and say UN is irrelevant, inconsequential, etc. In peace and security, it certainly can do with reform.
Okay. Ambassador Akbaruddin, one of the statements that have been made by you in the past has been also about global governance structures. You have said that the present structure of the UN is unfit to address 21st century challenges. And of course, there is a need for a more representative and inclusive Security Council, the one that reflects the diversity of international community. Why is it that we haven't got a Security Council position till now? You have served for several years there, and why is the resistance continuing from quarters which have been opposing India's permanent membership for years?
So you're right that there is a resistance to change, and it's not primarily about India. If it was only about India's membership of the Security Council, this matter would have been resolved much earlier, because I don't think there are big challenges of a nature that are insurmountable for India's membership. But when you try and reform an international body, there are other issues. Who represents, for example, Africa? That remains a major challenge. Africa says it wants two countries. It's not yet decided which would be the two countries. There are 54 countries in Africa, each of them having a different view. Similarly, there are challenges about the veto. Whether the veto should be restrained is a big emotive issue for most countries. Having said that, the 5 veto wielding powers do not want any change. Also, finally, we are right now in an era where competition dominates, and it's not an era of cooperation. Multilateral organizations and international organizations only work on the basis of possible cooperation. This is very like the Cold War, when there were no resolutions from the Security Council. There was one in 1959, for example. So we've been through worse times. The challenges are mounting today, but it's not about India. So India's case is sui generis. India is the most populous country, the country which is now economically shouldering much more than it was, and it is ready to provide global public goods. So India's case is pretty clear. I think the challenges are about the other elements of a package, and that will still take time.
Okay, then would you say that the United Nations has missed the reforms bus? Is reform still on card, and how long do you think it will take, because in terms of timeline?
So reform is not an event that you miss it. It's a process. It's got delayed. It's been sidetracked for long. The hope always for diplomats is that tomorrow will be better than yesterday. So we can't give up hope. Aspirations of a country like India, which is a young country, which is looking forward to a lot of hope in the future, we cannot give it up. It will be difficult. It's a challenge, but I would think so. The issues which, if you do not, let me put it another way, if you do not reform the Security Council, people will find other ways to address their problems. So it is in the interest of the Security Council and its permanent membership to try and accommodate the aspirations of a newer group of states who can add value to the Security Council. So it is in everybody's interest. It's only when will everybody see that it is in their interest. But we've started a new process under the Summit of the Future. It's a much more time-bound process. So let's have faith in it, give time and space. And it took a lot of time. I mean, all multilateral decisions take lots of time. For us, in the outside world, we are used to instant upgrading of our systems. For example, if you have an iPhone, you just press a button and it upgrades to the next level. Unfortunately, global governance is not like that. It takes time, but we have no cause for feeling despondent, because our future will be better. It will be a future in which we hope India will play a greater role inside the Security Council if reform is possible. Otherwise, there are institutions which lose their way. Multilateral institutions have also lost their way, and nobody would want that to happen. So it's best that they reform, but it's not a time-bound program that will lead to that.
Okay, so Ambassador Akbaruddin, if you're saying that there's no realistic timeline for achieving meaningful reforms, then can there be key milestones that we can watch out for? One view certainly is that there's no need, there is a need, I would say, to reform the veto power of the permanent members. Should it be reformed or abolished?
There's an ideal world and there is a real world. In the ideal world, it should be abolished, but which parliament is going to say that I am ready to give up the veto and abolish it, and I will now reduce my powers in a global body? It's going to be difficult to get support for any of this in any of the 5 permanent members. So the way forward is incremental change. So what is happening on the veto? There are 2 countries which haven't vetoed a single resolution for now close to 30 plus years. That's UK and France. There are other measures saying that in case of veto, it should be limited to extreme events, not veto on procedure, not veto on issues where everybody else is on one side. These are extreme, egregious events. You can use the veto. So they can be at best a restraint on it. I do not expect any of these countries to give up the veto, certainly not the US, Russia and China. They made it very clear they will not give up the theoretical framework of the veto. So while you may want it to be abolished, the best option is some format of restraint.
Yes, on multiple occasions, Ambassador, you've also spoken about little progress being made about the intergovernmental negotiations, which of course began in 2008. That is also stuck in limbo. There is a new global order, and there's a fast changing global order as well. We are living in times, as you said, which is far more, which is about competition than cooperation. Then what really is the use of these bodies or groups? Or do you think G20, for example, is far more inclusive and representative? You know, when India had the chair of G20, we saw it emerge as the voice of the global south. The G20 expanded and became G21.
So you're right that there are newer bodies which have emerged, which are doing a good job in the area that they're looking towards. So the G20 is an excellent body for economic decision making. The G20, as you know, doesn't want to touch political issues. We're talking of the political and the security and peace and security architecture. There is no other body. So also, let's also acknowledge that many of these smaller minilaterals and plurilaterals, these are important, but they don't have legitimacy by themselves. So what happens when the G20 decides? The G20 members then take it to the World Bank or to the IMF and then get the imprimatur of a legal change there. Similarly, there is no body for peace and security, and so by dispensing with whatever is a a relic of the past, you then have nothing, you then have to create something. So perhaps it's better to create, but we are not in a position to create at this stage. You will have to make do. Otherwise, sure, there will be other coalitions of the willing coming up. People will work in smaller groups and get things done. But that's all right for big countries like us. What happens to the global south, of whose leadership we lay claim to? There are 110 countries with populations of less than 10 million. They cannot be part of these small groups, and they always say that nothing about us without us. They won't want climate change. They won't want artificial intelligence to be discussed in small groups without even being engaged. So you have to have a platform, and that platform will be an inclusive platform, because whatever smaller groups do, they will have to bring it to larger groups to get approval, because climate change cannot be decided by 20 countries and implemented and expect that others will follow. Similarly, artificial intelligence, similarly, cyber. So there are many areas which are transboundary in nature, where you will require the cooperation of broader than small groups. And for that, if the UN is not there, there have to be some other platform that will give a legal imprimatur. Otherwise, what the G4 does or the G20 does, it doesn't have a legal bearing, because they still have to go to a organization or entity which has a legal bearing. And please tell me which will be that international entity which has a legal bearing.
Okay. So let me ask you that question, which is that international entity which will have the legal bearing, and then what really is the future of the United Nations?
So we come back to that we need to have an inclusive organization. However imperfect it is, we live in an imperfect world. So to think that the UN is the only imperfection in a global landscape is not a fair option to look at. Sure, big inclusive bodies will be slow. They will be like the minimum common denominator, but they still are required. So each has a place. Minilateralism, plurilateralism, all have places, but they cannot dispense with multilateralism. So you will have to work out a harmonious situation where all three exist. It will take time. It may take years, may take decades. These things take a long time, because if you have to move far, you have to move with everybody. If you want to move fast, you can move alone, but then transboundary issues cannot be solved alone or by small groups or by self-proclaimed clubs. Let's be very clear. Look at the NSG. I mean, the NSG is a self-proclaimed club which doesn't want India inside it, despite India being a nuclear power, despite India using nuclear energy for a lot of purposes. Does that grouping contribute to growth of nuclear energy? No, but it's a self-declared club. So self-declared clubs have a role, in the sense that they can be used as sounding boards, they can come up with suggestions, but you still have to go to inclusive bodies, and that body, for all its inadequacies, will remain the United Nations. If it didn't exist, you would have to create some other body of that sort.
All right, Ambassador